Hi, I'm Gogo, and boy, do I have a video for you. It's about, well, I'll give you a hint. Not Tigger. Springs, suspension, motorcycling, the whole package all together. How you can manipulate these things, use these things, and choose these things to make your overall motorcycling experience, no matter what bike you're riding, better, safer, faster. The thing is, we all have attention spans that can last, well, these days, like 30 seconds. And this is not a 30-second video. So I've broken into two parts. The first part will be more basic, right? We're going to talk about springs and shocks and forks and travel and windows of travel and how you don't want to violate these things. It's very important, and there's a good story at the end with me screwing up and crashing. But it's worthwhile. Part two is going to be a little more intense, a little more controversial, and piss some people off. So let's get to it. When we buy the motorcycle that we love, the first thing we always want to do is buy something for it. Something, performance part, something that makes it look better, sound better. Always want to get something to make it a little bit better. But interestingly enough, and this is kind of ironic, we don't usually buy the things that make the most sense, right? Your spring, for instance, plays such a huge role in not just your suspension, but your overall motorcycle experience. And it's so easy to access and to manipulate and to change to your liking, to your needs. But the majority of us buy a motorcycle with whatever spring rate it came with, which when they made the motorcycle, they made it for a little bit for everybody and not at all for any one person. And we're one person, right? So we buy a motorcycle, and most of us will ride our motorcycle the way it came, with that spring rate and that oil in the forks, and just ride it like that for the life of the motorcycle, considering us, and never change one of the most critical things that impacts your whole experience. Because suspension has a bad reputation. Like, a lot of people refer to it as a black art. It's not black. To me, black means no light. And light is hope. Light is something that you can work towards, right? And black is nothing. So that's not suspension. Suspension is nothing. There's plenty of hope with suspension. You can figure it out. I promise you. You can figure out how to make your bike better. It's not black. Maybe a little gray, right? And half of the reason it's gray is because there's a lot of bullshit online about especially springs and something that is referred to as preload. A lot of people don't really understand what preload does, what preload means. And I am here to dispel the bullshit. At the risk of being annoying, and trust me, I can annoy the shit out of anybody, I am not going to just go straight into preload. Here's what it is, here's how you adjust it. There's plenty of videos online about that. I'm going to start this at ground zero. Remember, suspension is a black art. There's no hope. It's just total darkness. Well, this is how we're going to get rid of that whole idea. We're going to start from ground zero. Number one. Suspension. What is suspension and why do we need it? Okay? This is the most basic form of this conversation. You and your motorcycle, you go down the road, right? Wonderful. Only problem is the road goes like this. So the idea of suspension is the road goes like this and your bike stays like that. Now that's really hard to do actually, and I just nailed it. There's suspension, okay? Ideally, you stay steady and your tires follow the road. Your tires are always in contact with the pavement. You have traction, drivability, you're comfortable, wonderful. But there's a number of steps that you need to kind of synchronize properly to get to this happy place, right? And the first one is understanding springs. Okay, so this is a spring. This is a spring. There's a spring in your ballpoint pen. Springs have a shape, they have a length, and they have a rate. Okay? Rate is the really important point of this here. Okay? So springs are rated on an amount, a distance that they travel, and how much force it takes to make them travel. So let's say this is a 100-pound spring. That means it's 100 pounds per inch. That's the way we rate it in pounds, okay? That means if I take a 100-pound dumbbell and I put it on top of this spring, it's gonna compress this spring 1 inch. 100 pounds, 1 inch. If I take another 100-pound dumbbell and I put it on, it's gonna go 2 inches. If I take a third dumbbell and now 3 inches, linear. It doesn't change. 100, 200, 300, it's linear, okay? There's another way to rate a spring like this, and most of them are rated this way. It's actually in the metric system. So this spring says it's at 95. So that means 95 newtons per millimeter. It's the same idea, right? How much force and how much distance. So 95 newtons per millimeter means it takes 95 newtons to compress this spring 1 millimeter. It's very different than the pounds, right? Pounds is 100 pounds per inch. Whew, it's a lot long, and a metric is just 1 millimeter, but it's the same idea, right? Force and travel, okay? Travel is an interesting word. Travel is our next word. Considering a motorcycle suspension, what it is your motorcycle and you, like the weight of you two together, is suspended on top of your springs, okay? So that's the whole word suspension, that's what it is. You're suspended on your springs. If you were bolted straight to your wheels as the motorcycle went over the ground, the bike would go like this. If you hit bumps fast, you'd bounce on the air, you'd be all over the place. It would hurt, you'd have no traction, and you'd crash. So, suspension, right? And the key word, travel. So as you hopefully are riding like this, and your wheels are going up and down like this is the travel, okay? You could map it on a chart. Let's say this is the top of the chart, this is the bottom of the chart, and somewhere around the middle is where you and your motorcycle want to be hanging out. That's where you want to be riding, right? And you can actually map this in a chart, which I do actually. If you look behind me, my shock has a little potentiometer, and my forks also have these potentiometers. And what they do with this AIM data acquisition thing, there's a computer back here in the tail section, and it records with GPS everywhere I go around the track, and it records where the shock moves and how the forks move. So I can go back to the computer later and look at a chart that has top and a bottom. So bottomed out, meaning the shock is compressed all the way, right? And the forks are compressed all the way or all the way extended. And I could see on this chart, whoa, this is where my suspension is moving. This is my travel, okay? So travel is a key word, and mapping the movement of your suspension throughout your travel. These are very key words here, okay? Now, why is travel so important? Your shock has travel. Your forks have travel. And your shock, for instance, has about 50 millimeters of travel. That's like average for a motorcycle. And your forks, 120 millimeters of travel, 120, something like that. That's also average. But why it's so different, right? So why is the shock so different than the forks? Just considering travel, right? So in the rear of your motorcycle, there's a ratio of how much the shock moves compared to how much the axle moves. And they're in two different places, and one of them is on a lever. So how it works is, on a lot of bikes, including the Super Duke that's behind me, the shock moves 1 millimeter, the axle moves 2 millimeters. It's just 1 to 2 or 2 to 1, however you want to think about it. So if you consider that, and this shock has 50 millimeters of travel, like it goes at its longest setting, and it only will go so long, and then it locks out. So at its longest setting, it's 50 millimeters. That's as much as it can extend here on the travel. And when it's all the way compressed, it's 0. So 0 to 50 millimeters. Since it's 2 to 1, or 1 to 2, 50 millimeters here at the shock means 100 millimeters at the back. So now the motorcycle makes a little more sense, right? The front is 120-ish and the rear is 100-ish, right? So similar amounts of travel. The bikes ideally will be balanced somewhere in there, right? So now we understand travel, front and rear, how much we have, 100 millimeters in the back, 120 in the front, and we want, as our wheels follow the ground, we want to be operating in that travel window, okay? You don't want to violate that window, meaning you don't want to bottom out at the bottom if you were on a chart. You don't want, when the force of a bump comes, you want to absorb that force without hitting. We don't want this shock to compress all the way against the stop, because, I'll tell you why. There's energy in bumps. I know it's an odd thing to say. I get it. But this is the way my brain understands it. Each one of these bumps in the road, there's energy, okay? And that energy can change, can vary, depending on how fast you hit that bump, right? You hit that bump at 50 miles an hour, maybe it's 200 pounds of force that your suspension is gonna have to absorb, right? 200 pounds of force. You hit that bump at 150 miles an hour, maybe it's 700 pounds of force. So you better have your suspension set up and your spring rate selected so that you can absorb that much energy, right? And that energy is not negotiable. 150 miles an hour against that bump means 700 pounds of force. And if you don't absorb those 700 pounds with your shock or with your forks, let's just use the shock for instance. Let's say you only absorb 600 pounds of force and then your shock bottoms out. What's gonna happen with that extra 100 pounds of force? Something is gonna absorb it. It's not negotiable. Either you're gonna get shot up out of the seat, boom, or maybe your tire is gonna get compressed like this. And you know, when you're riding and you feel, oh, you tip the bike this way, you tip the bike this way, it feels like it's got certain composure, like you're used to the way your bike feels. Wait until you feel your motorcycle when it bottoms out, when you still have that extra 100 pounds of force to absorb. And let's say your tire absorbs all that force. Your tire was round and now it's squished. You lose that round shape, you lose the turn, you lose the traction, you lose, everything goes to hell, right? So you don't want to bottom out. So we understand this travel, our suspension, if you look at the chart, this travel like this, and you understand you don't want to bottom out. I mean, you don't really want to bang off the top either, but that's not as critical. You'll still lose traction. Like if you're braking and the shock extends to its fullest amount, your rear wheel is going to come into the air because the shock only gets so long. It doesn't just keep going forever. It only gets to its full length, which is right now its full length. That's it. Okay, so we understand springs, how they have rates and they have a little bit of travel, and we understand suspension, it's got to move, and we understand the shock and the forks, travel, right? And finally, we understand now that we have a window, if you want to think of it like topped out, bottomed out. We have a window that we want our suspension to work in. It'd be nice to use most of that window, right? Because that's going to be comfortable. If this is the middle of your range, topped out, bottomed out, and your suspension only looked like this, you're hitting bumps. And that just means your suspension is not really moving. So you're absorbing it. Remember, the energy is not negotiable. So it's there. You can't do anything about it except react to it. And if your suspension is not reacting to it, your fillings are coming out because boom, 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 you're hitting stuff. You don't really like riding your motorcycle. You only ride 200 miles a month probably because it's uncomfortable. This is why this video is important. Getting more out of your motorcycle, your experience, more joy. You bought the motorcycle to be happy. So let's figure out how to be happy. I told you we're starting from ground zero because we're gonna make this dark black room not black anymore. There is hope and there is light, and there's way more to this video. So let me share with you a little story about why you don't want to bottom out, okay? Because I've been racing a long time and I've experienced a lot of things. Unfortunately for me, I've experienced a lot of bad things because I made mistakes. And let me tell you about this one mistake that I made. It's a long time ago. It's New York, Long Island. What racetrack is on Long Island? Well, there used to be a famous racetrack, real infamous almost, to tell you the truth, because it was so fast. I mean, 6th gear, down to 5th gear, back to 6th gear, leaned over, on your knee, going so fast you could feel the heat coming through your pucks, coming through your leathers, onto your knee. Heat, like, oh, scary fast. Amazing pavement. Some say there was coral worked into the pavement. So even in the rain, it had amazing traction. Pretty bumpy because, you know, every year we raced at Bridgehampton was the last year and the track was going to close because the neighboring community always wanted to shut it down. These guys with motorcycles, it's too loud. So not a lot of maintenance. And as the story goes, when they made Bridgehampton, they cut it out of like a forest, a pine forest in these like sand dunes areas. And they just chopped the trees down and hauled them away. They didn't take the stumps out. So, as it was explained to me, when they paved over the stumps, a decade goes by, another decade, the stumps rot and rot and rot. And so the ground kind of sank wherever there was a pine tree. So the surface of Bridgehampton, in some places more than others, was kind of bumpy wherever there was a tree, right? And so everybody who raced there regularly knew the line. Like you knew where to go and you knew where not to go, right? So that was all well and good, and you could turn some fast times. I was lucky enough to turn some pretty fast times, very close to the track record. It was a great track. But if you asked me then how much I loved it, I was scared to death of that place. I mean, it wanted to kill you. The track was as wide as the track was, and then there was 10 feet, 15 feet, depending on where you were on the track, of runoff. And runoff was deep, white, I'm with my girlfriend at the beach, sand. Like that kind of a surface. Your front tire dove into the sand and you just cartwheeled. Like there was no saving the bike. I saw one person save it one time, buddy of mine. And we were like high-fiving when we came back. I can't believe you survived Bridgehampton. So, scary place. So this one weekend, it was in 1996, it's raining. If Bridgehampton isn't scary enough, now you got to do it in the rain. And it was fog, right? So in the race before mine, you can hear it. You can't see much, right? You hear the bikes go by like this, and you barely see them go by. And you're thinking, oh my God, please cancel my race. Like, I don't really want to go out there. But I went out there, right? And usually in dry races, because Bridgehampton was so flat out, the guys I raced against, who had more budget and bigger trailers and multiple bikes and everything, they would walk away on the straight because, you know, the titanium this and the flat slide that and trick bikes, right? Fast. We'd start a race and get to 4th gear by turn 1, they already yarded me. We didn't even get to the skill part yet. We didn't even get to one turn. Already, I'm losing ground because there was just these advantages. But not when it was raining. Rain was the great equalizer. So I'm in a rain race, and usually I'd be in maybe 5th place, struggling, and I'm in 2nd, right behind the leader's tire. Really, really good guy, Richie Alexander. Still talk to him today. He was well supported. His dad owned a Suzuki dealership, and he was fast. He went on to win an AMA Super Sport Championship, I think, a couple of years later. Anyway, so Richie's flying. Not so much in the rain. So I'm following him for the first lap, and it's Richie, me, and big gap to the next guys, and I'm running his back tire. And I'm thinking, he's usually walked away from me by now. What's happening? Where is the turn we're going to go through? And here it is. He's going to walk away. Doesn't happen. He's just checking up everywhere. So we start the second lap. And here we come onto this famous part of the track called Echo Valley. And it was a heavy braking zone. Lean into a left and go up over a rise. This is a great track. But when you're going to pass somebody, you can't be on the line. We all knew the line to be on, and you knew where you didn't want to be because of bumps from the old trees or whatever. It was not a perfect track surface. But you got to pass somebody, you got to get off the line. Prior to the race, because it was raining, I wound out my compression, took a couple of clicks out of rebound, softened the bike up, and made a mistake that's pertinent to this whole conversation. And this is one of the myths that is so commonly misunderstood and misrepresented, even by suspension gurus that I see and talk to and work with today. So many decades later, people are still making this same mistake, still misunderstanding this thing. A spring is a spring, right? We already talked about linearity and how much force it takes to compress. And I used to think backing off the preload made the spring softer. I'll be much softer. I'll be able to absorb the bumps better. Wrong. Okay, so I'll tell you why in a minute, but now we're back at Bridgehampton, and I'm going to outbrake Richie Alexander. Here I go up his inside, I hit the brakes, and forks go down, and I hit one of those tree bumps. Bottom of the forks. Front tire absorbs the rest of it, the tire squishes, bike falls, I take out Richie. Richie was a great sport about it, right? He wanted to kill me at first, but 14 seconds later, he's helping me pick my bike up and we get off the track. Funny thing is, decades later, Richie became like the race team manager of Jordan Suzuki. And I always loved Michael Jordan. What a hero. Like, I always wanted to meet Michael Jordan. And I remember thinking, I'll never meet him now because I took out Richie. So don't bottom out your suspension because you'll never meet Michael Jordan. Okay, so why did I crash? I had the right idea, actually. Backing off my settings for the rain. You're going a little bit slower, you're hitting bumps at different rates of speed, you want a little more traction. Backing things off was not a bad idea. But why did this cause me to crash? This is where we get into preload and what happens when you adjust preload that's actually different than what you think is going to happen. This is like a mystery that lots of people disagree about. It's kind of controversial, and we're going to get into it in part 2 next.